what is a budget that does incremental change and chips away as it should, and what can it actually do to propel us in the directions that we know we must travel, that this is the future. For many years, ladies and gentlemen, I have been watching the 3D printing industry develop across the globe. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, not just in small scale prototyping, but across the globe. Even big industrial engineering corporations are using 3D printing technology to, they have made it, metal printing is possible these days. People are printing houses. It is possible. So, a few weeks ago, I wanted to get a microphone cover adjusted, and a specific requirement we had for an attachment to be made to a microphone. I said, hey, let's get it 3D printed. We only need 10-15 of them. I'm sure in the national capital of India, it's perfectly possible. It was a struggle. Couldn't get it done. Okay. So, there are certain things that are patently obvious to us, right from the basics, that in a country that produces a food surplus, people still go to bed hungry, that we still don't have people who have houses on their heads, and we still have dilemmas all over the place in resolving them. So, let's take a jump in to both imagine what an audacious economic exercise can help us achieve, because, ladies and gentlemen, we have to do both. We have to reach the moon and Mars and at the same time cook a meal for our children every day. Joining us on the broadcast as we build up to the budget speech of the Finance Minister, the second time this year as she heads into a record number of consecutive budget speeches. Sameer Gogia this morning, he is Executive Director of Deloitte. Bindu Dalmia joining us, she is a former chairperson in the Niti Aayog National Committee for Financial Inclusion and Literacy. Ajay Dua, former Secretary in the Commerce Ministry. Mitali Nikor joining us, Joyita Basu, editor of the Sunday Guardian, and Lieutenant General A.K. Bhatt of the Indian Space Association joining us on the broadcast. Good morning to all of you. General Bhatt, I'm going to start with you, sir, because I want to start on something that is aspirational. We've been having, sir, you and I, conversations on the developments which are fast-paced of a private space industry in this country. From where we started these conversations, before the policy was drafted, before indeed ISPA was announced just over a year and a half ago, and you become then Secretary General, where have we come? Where are we today, sir?
You know, when the government announced the policy of opening space to private players, the non-government entities, it was a great leap of faith. All believe that it will take some time before the private sector does emerge with something tangible. But what the private sector, especially the startups, have done is, in a very short time, they have lived up to the faith of the nation and the government. There have been two startups, as we know, Skyroot, which did a pre-orbital launch more than a year back, and now Agnikul, and like you mentioned early morning today, 3D printing. Here was a rocket engine which has been 3D printed. And this cryogenic engine has been successfully launched on a suborbital launch. You know, with what Agnikul has been able to achieve and Skyroot, we hope that the Indian launch sector in the private sector very soon will become a global player. That apart, we have now startups and private companies who have launched their satellites. As of today, there are 5 private companies in India who have launched satellites. Some of them are looking for making constellations, as you are well aware. All this proves that the capability which is there in India, if the regulations are in place, if the support of the government is there, will take India to where we aspire to be there in the future.
Okay. So it's going to happen. It is happening. So what is required then, sir, from impetus? Because the policy, as you know, is being put into place. We know that ISRO is opening up like never before, really, really fast. But at the end of the day, what is the goal orientation? What do we want to achieve? Where do we wish to be? Because you have Elon Musk doing the launches and Starlink coming up. So where do we want to be?
If I would have to put the two aspirations of the nation from the space sector, one is the exploratory domain, going to the moon, firstly having the Gaganyaan mission successful, then having a Bharatiya space station, and thereafter landing human beings on moon, and in the future even Mars. That is what is the role and more set up for ISRO. But more importantly for the private sector is that from a meager 2.3 to 2.4% of the global economy, we aspire that this goes up at least to 8 to 10% in the next 10 years.
Okay.
That we have a larger share of the global space economy.
Okay.
And what it does is, it, apart from improving the economy, it brings in jobs. It brings in opportunities.
No, but is the space sector, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, here's the irony, believe it or not, okay? At the point of time when John F. Kennedy made his speech that before the decade is out, we will be on the moon. From that point to 8 years later, when they actually reached the moon, 1% of the population of the United States of America was working on that program, the Apollo program. 1%. That is 300,000 people were just working on building a rocket ship. Obviously, General Bhatt, that is not the current scenario. So when we are talking about jobs, we are talking about high-skilled jobs. And we are talking about high-skilled impact. Why is that important?
We always say, space is rocket science. And rocket science is complicated. It requires skill sets which are far superior. In the STEM, it is on the upper end of what skill sets are required. But what I am confident in the country, with the kind of startups we have, the caliber they reflect, that this will not be a problem as soon as impetus is given to this sector. More and much more important is finances coming here, financial incentives coming here.
Okay.
For the sector to be.
Okay, just hold your thought, General Bhatt. Let me pick up a larger conversation with the rest of our guests, because there is a larger theme. Ladies and gentlemen, a budgetary exercise, while all fascinating for us, is limited in what it can do. I keep repeating, this is not a conversation now for indirect taxation, because GST has been removed completely from the budgetary exercise. It belongs in the realm of the GST Council. This is not the day when you're going to see a finance minister announcing grand scale reforms. You are going to see tweaks and changes, because the devil is in the detail. Getting the detail right is important. But is there a room to digest the political economy of the day? Let me set that up with Joyita Basu before I bring the others in. Joyita Basu, here we are, because the difference between sitting here in February and sitting here now, let's not kid ourselves, is a massive exercise that has happened in between, in which 650 million people have expressed their sentiments to the government of the day, which is a return to power. How will that government absorb that sentiment, if at all?
Well, I think the budget will have to reflect. We'll have to take into account the fact is that, they did not get a majority on their own. So automatically what it translates as there is unhappiness among large sections of the people. They have to take into account that, the middle class in particular, the salaried middle class in particular, there is a sense of economic distress over there, that people are not comfortable. And, if you look at, say, for example, credit card spending that has gone up remarkably, it's been a huge jump.
Yes.
So automatically when people are using more credit cards, that means there is financial trouble that is happening. So what with the middle class and the lower middle class, upper middle class, the salaried class in particular, they will have to give more relief in terms of that. I say, for example, housing loan. you give only a 2 lakh deduction that for income tax. You have to raise that limit, which is absolutely insane. When you look at the West, there is an interest of 2%, 3% in housing loans. Here, the banks take an interest rate of say 10%, 8%, 9%. I mean, that's insane. No one pays like that in the rest of the world. I mean, at least I would say, here you are aspiring to be the 5th largest economy of the world in this, but you are treating us like Soviet era banking system, and I mean Soviet era interest rates and all. So that will have to change. And the thing is that the agricultural class, what are you going to do? What are you going to do in terms of farm reforms? Because farm law reforms, I think these Kisan people have already started another march to put the pressure, obviously, ahead of the assembly elections. I mean, definitely they should not be giving in to populist measures like even I think they have done something for MSP, but they will have to think of those also. So basically, the rural and urban.
Okay, we can argue all day what is populist and what is actually social justice. Whether if you give a free railway ticket to someone or a bus ride to someone, is that populism or is that social justice? We can argue that all day because we've been arguing that for the past 80 years. Ajay Dua joining us. Ajay ji, if you look at the numbers, the economy looks okay, right? Inflation is decent, fiscal deficit is decent, GDP numbers are very healthy and ticking upwards. The global economic situation seems to be a bit better. I know there's an X factor of an American election coming up. But given the shock of COVID, which seems to be dissipating, shock of Ukraine war seems to be dissipating, it's looking good. If you go to the markets in the big cities, they're crowded, people are purchasing. The stock market is at record highs, the foreign exchange reserves are at record highs. Everything is looking good. So in that scenario, what do we need to happen?
I think the economic survey, and you've just talked about the positives which the survey pointed out yesterday, all very true. But the survey has also taken care to point out the challenges which lie ahead. And I would think that the Finance Minister, in order to reflect what you just asked, Joyita, and you mentioned yourself about the political realism, what has happened during the last 4 months or so, that taking those into account, the budget would have to balance now the interests of 2 or 3 categories. One, apart from the allies and their demands, including the special status for their states, Bihar, Andhra Pradesh, and maybe there was a demand even for Orissa, a couple of days made there. That apart from that, they will have to look at the rural sector, agriculture, much more, address the issues there. For one, some of those things are real. Second, it got reflected in the voting pattern. Second, I would say that they would also need to look at the fact that the government cannot be doing all the heavy lifting which it has done in the last 3 or 4 years. The private sector has to get involved. So how do we get the private sector? Private sector is a free sector. So the government can't force it. Can the milieu be created?
Okay.
Through the budget? Everything you very rightly said, the budget can't do everything, but it certainly can do its own bit to make sure that the private sector becomes more active in capital formation, as well as the government addresses their concern of higher demand. That means higher consumption in the economy through the budget. Can something be done so that the demand increases?
Okay.
That means demand at the bottom and the demand in the middle.
Okay, so let's boil it down for people watching the broadcast who maybe been doing budget watching for the past 30 years, maybe the past 3. The budget is now increasingly a detailing exercise. All of the major schemes and announcements and reforms are announced separately. So if India is going to do 1 crore solar rooftop, that's already been announced. Now the budget will have to find the finances for it in some context. Yes, a lot of the schemes are approaching saturation. Let's see what happens. Bindu Dalmia with us, Samir Gogia joining us now in the studio as well. Binduji, let me get you into this. What then, other than some fine-tuning, are we expecting in this conversation, this speech by Nirmala Sitharaman in a couple of hours from now?
Morning, Mr. Gulati, and thank you for having me on the show. Morning to my panelists and your viewers. First of all, let me start with stating that despite the dynamics of a coalition, I expect this budget to surprise hugely on the upside, because this is the one time for the coalition partners to course correct what went wrong or what was inadequate during Modi 1 and Modi 2.0. Having said that, the government had done the right thing in following an infrastructure growth model and allocating huge funds towards it, which which would have hoped to crowd in private investments, as it has a scope of great multiplier coefficients.
Okay.
However, private investments were not forthcoming adequately, as we know, because of lack of demand. Now, that is what needs spurring where the budget is concerned. I expect huge incremental reforms in terms of not only tax measures being announced here, but also for structural factor market reforms, ease of doing business. And let me just state one thing, that infrastructure development has its limitations, as does social welfare spending, social spending and welfare spending. We need to look at refocusing at new centers of gravity for incremental job creation. And I will just briefly outline those as saying we need to look at GSDP of states being increased. We need to look at urbanization, the stock markets, because they're a big source of revenue today to the government, rationalizing reforms there, manufacturing, which only contributes 15% to the GDP, and exports, which is only 3% of global exports. Increasing women's participation. So it's a much more holistic view than just looking at infrastructure as the propeller of growth.
So you have to keep on chipping away. All of that easier said than done. And the biggest problems we seem to be now facing is that if you allocate the money, you don't know how and where to spend it rapidly enough. That you can come out with the policy, but the implementation becomes tough. Let's get a word in from Mr. Gogia. Mr. Gogia, here we are, sir. Okay. 3 months later, a major electoral exercise has taken place. That electoral exercise has delivered a stable government. So that's one check. But it also delivered a slightly different formulation of a government. Is this conversation by Nirmala Sitharaman therefore going to be substantively different from what it was 3 months ago, in your opinion?
Thank you, and very good morning to all the panelists. What I believe, I think this budget, Modi 3.0, will give a weight for the 5-year journey of this government. This will being the first year after the new mandate. This will give a path to the major policy decision. If you look at, they have a consistent growth for last 3 years in the economy, in the GDP. However, the inflation has been a major concern. So there has to be a major shift on agriculture inflation that need to be curbed. However, this policy decision, maybe on the direct tax parts, they need to have a consistent approach, because the tax rates, if you see the corporate tax rate, this has been consistently all throughout. If we compare it with global players, this has been a reduced rate. And last year, on individual taxation, we see there has been less of, they need to increase the consumption from the individual households. So they need to have more disposable income in the hands of individuals. So we may see a little change on the tax rate, where individual may have a more disposable income in their hand, so that economy can be, more money can be pumped up in the economy. However, inflation, that's a basic concern for the government right now. And we could see certain major steps by the government, because the target is to reach out at 4.4%.
Okay, but I have to ask you, Mr. Gogia, okay, if we are discussing today, that we were discussing this in January as well, right? That I mean, middle class, come on. These are the guys who salaried people who have to pay the taxes, then pay the taxes on the taxes. Every time you earn your income, you pay a tax. Then when you go buy something with the income after paying the tax, you pay a tax. So you pay tax and tax and tax. But we were discussing this earlier. So why do it now? Why not do it 3 months ago in terms of taxation. You could have said that was the time to do it. People would have loved you and voted for you.
See, the last 3 months, it was not a full budget. Considering all the election commission concerns, you can't have these swaps for the public. So definitely the government need to defer it to the major budget once you have a new government elected. So that couldn't have been done in the last interim budget. But definitely this time people are expecting more disposable income in their hand, and they individual class may see certain changes.
So if the expectations, of course, when are built high, let's hope they're not set up for a large sense of disappointment. Yes.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.